I'd now like to hand over to our next speaker, Reverend Dr. Mark Chapman, who is Vice Principal, didn't want to demote you. Sorry. Vice Principal and Academic Dean at Ripon College, Cuddesdon, and Professor of the History of Modern Theology at the University of Oxford. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation from Martine and the committee, another bearded man. It's good to be in the Festival of Britain Church. This was the official Festival of Britain Church in a slightly different incarnation, I think, but the wonderful pictures behind by Hans Freibusch show a lot of women there at the very beginning, and that's crucial to remember. So I'm going to talk about, here we are, establishment or discrimination, a little bit about mutual flourishing and all that, but I really want to look at how the Act of Synod came into being and the role that Parliament played in that, and what a disaster it's actually been. But I want to begin by something that happened last week. I had to sit down with a couple of my students who are due to be ordained this summer, and I had to start writing their final reports that go on to the bishop. Now, there's a bit in the report to say that we've discussed the 5 guiding principles. Now, as it happens, both of the students I saw were women. It wasn't a long discussion of the 5 guiding principles, but it was important. First of all, we made it clear that there will be some parishes, possibly in their own deanery, where there will be fellow office holders who do not believe that they will be priests. And secondly, I tell them that if they read the principles, they will discover that they are completely incoherent. Now, the principles say directly that the Church of England is fully and unequivocally committed to all orders of ministry being open equally to all, and anyone who ministers within the Church of England must be prepared to acknowledge that the Church of England has reached a clear decision on the matter. So far, so good. But they then say that the clear decision wasn't as clear as all that, because other churches and churches in the Anglican Communion haven't made the same decision. It then goes on to say that if somebody's theology means that they're convinced that the clear decision was the wrong decision, then that's okay, because it's in the spectrum and tradition of the Anglican Communion. Now, this is a very weird statement indeed to anybody who knows anything at all about the history of the Church of England. The fact that something is in the spectrum and the tradition of another church within or outside the Anglican Communion has absolutely no bearing on the Church of England whatsoever, which is why there is a Church of England in the first place. So what is called a clear decision is in fact not a clear decision at all, but is in fact a decision to allow clergy to choose not to be in communion with other clergy if they are theologically convinced that they are right and the decision-making authorities of the church are wrong. So when I speak with my students, I have to say that in fact we have 2 churches in the Church of England which are increasingly less in communion with one another, and that for some the clear decision is not a clear decision at all. Now, we now have the bizarre situation where we treat fellow members of the Church of England in much the same way that we treat our ecumenical partners with whom we have more or less friendly relations. But despite their incoherence, I must admit that I rather reluctantly voted for the 5 guiding principles when I was on General Synod. I did so because I recognised that they simply codified the mess that was already there. Now, when it came to the women bishops legislation, many of us tried to recover as much as possible from the disaster of the Act of Synod. And for Watch at the time, and for me, it remained absolutely crucial that all diocesan bishops, whether they're women or men, had to have the same canonical authority. This means that even clergy in parishes served pastorally and sacramentally by the likes of the enthusiastic new self-styled missionary bishop of Oswestry. I've got a picture of him on the next slide. They have to swear their oath of canonical obedience to their diocesan bishop. I know it's far from ideal, but it stopped the stupidity of coordinated jurisdictions and all sorts of other legalese that was flying around at the time, which was trying to prevent people from having to recognize the canonical authority of their diocesan bishop. It was the best that could be hoped for at the time, but it wasn't great. But the more I think about it, the more convinced I've become that the Church of England has brought the theological nonsense of the 5 guiding principles on itself, and it did so back in 1993. And one of the reasons it did so was because of the audacity of some parliamentarians and the failure of nerve in the bishops, which led to the Act of Synod, which effectively destroyed the sacramental unity of the Church. So how is it that this came to be in the one institution that is established on the principle that there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free? How is it that that one institution can decide to discriminate and have that discrimination structuralized without time limit? There is, interestingly, on the 5 guiding principles, it says they are there for eternity. So how is it that we get into this mess? Now, let me begin in 1919 with the so-called Enabling Act, which created the Church Assembly. That offered a degree of self-government for the Church, even if many measures had to be returned to Parliament for ratification after consideration by the Ecclesiastical Committee. That's composed of 15 members from each of the Houses of Parliament. Parliament retained an effective power of veto, which obviously it exercised in 1928 and 1929 over the revised prayer book. Now, with the setting up of the General Synod in 1969, very little changed. Parliament could still veto important ecclesiastical legislation. So, for instance, after the introduction of the Alternative Services Book in 1980, most of us will probably remember that, but not everybody. Viscount Cranborne, Tory MP, introduced a bill to protect the prayer book, which gained a support of the majority in the House of Lords. In 1984, another bill was introduced by Lord Sudeley, who withdrew it after Robert Rancy, Archbishop of Canterbury, obviously, said that there would be assurances that the prayer book would be protected in perpetuity. Now, there was still a significant number of parliamentarians who saw Parliament, rather than Synod, as expressing the will of the laity. Later, in the 1980s, the Ecclesiastical Committee held up the efforts by the General Synod to allow the ordination of divorcees and those married to divorcees. And incidentally, having married a divorcee in 1988, that move held up my ordination for a few years, which meant that I got a job in a theological college, which may or may not have been a good thing for the 1,200 clergy or so that I've taught, some of whom are here today indeed. But more to the point, it's always struck me that that particular event in the end of the 1980s was in some sense a limbering up for what happened over the ordination of women in the early 1990s. So what happened after General Synod passed the Women Priests legislation in November 1992? I'll acknowledge my debt to Judith Maltby, who's done a lot of work on this. I think what's important is that Parliament significantly influenced the so-called safeguards that led to the Act of Synod. I think we should always remember that the 1992 legislation had a lot of safeguards for opponents. There was that generous financial package for clergy who thought they had to resign their posts, and parishes could opt out of the exercise of women's ministry locally. These were pragmatic solutions for what was obviously a very big change. But the pragmatic solution of the 1992 legislation had clear limits. There weren't any special bishops or separate system of pastoral and sacramental care. So how is it that we arrive at the Act of Synod? Well, firstly, the meetings of the bishops after November 1992 were very fearful that somehow the opponents would not be properly safeguarded. It was a message that was constantly repeated by such organisations as Cost of Conscience. And with this came the idea of two integrities, and the idea that pastoral care for opponents could only be exercised by a bishop who hadn't ordained women, which contradicted directly what the bishops had said. In making such provision, they said, we do not and we cannot accept the theological reasoning behind the view that in some way those bishops and priests who participate in the ordination of women to the priesthood thereby invalidate their sacramental ministry. But that proved wishful thinking. Because the bishops wanted to ensure that there would be no no-go dioceses for women, even in traditional strongholds like Chichester, the PEV, the Flying Bishops idea, slipped in tit for tat by the back door. It was a bit of an accident. Now, when it came to the discussion of the women priests measure in the House of Commons in October 1993, many MPs argued for further safeguards for opponents of the ordination of women. So there was a really weird coalition that was formed from across the parties, including the maverick Labour MP Frank Field, Simon Hughes, a Liberal Democrat, and Patrick Cormack, a Conservative, who'd opposed the ASB back in the 1980s. All of them argued vehemently that opposing parishes needing oversight from sympathetic bishops who needed oversight from sympathetic bishops who refused to ordain women. So Frank Field said this: he felt that their role was as parliamentarians to protect the interests of constituents who may be adversely affected by a church measure. We are quite rightly much concerned with, and will no doubt spend much time on, how this position of minorities is protected. Now, the underlying assumption was that the generous provisions of the measure weren't themselves sufficient. Some people went much further. So the burger-eating John Selwyn Gummer, who'd been received already into the Roman Catholic Church, was anxious that few bishops would be queuing up to fill episcopal roles when they felt that there were 40 ordinations taking place. He said that the measure destroyed the whole basis of the Elizabethan settlement, which sought to create a church of the nation in which everybody, except those who were at the extreme ends, could worship together. And the future dancer Anne Widdecombe, another Catholic convert, she felt that the women priests legislation undermined the whole moral basis of the church, which appeared to be succumbing to the spirit of the age. She was asked by Claire Short, who'd been a Roman Catholic, a Labour MP, why she felt so much bitterness, and she replied that her feelings went much further than bitterness. It is, she said, anger and grief, which sometimes sounds like bitterness. It's utter disbelief at what has been going on, and that we have not only managed to consecrate bishops who do not believe in the resurrection and the virgin birth, but that we cannot get our moral message across. Yes, I am very angry. Now, against such a backdrop, many MPs, even those who supported ordination of women, like Frank Field and Simon Hughes, they didn't regard the promotion of equality as the overriding value. Hughes even reassured his opponents that it was absolutely right for there to be sex discrimination in the church against a woman in respect of her ordination or giving of a license or permission to serve or officiate. And the Ecclesiastical Committee had earlier chosen not to consult with any women clergy at all, but heard from many opponents, some of whom were particularly outspoken, like John Broadhurst, who felt that asking an opponent bishop to license a woman would be like asking a vegetarian to eat meat. That kind of language was very common at the time. Now, in the Ecclesiastical Committee, the stalwart defender of the prayer book, Patrick Cormack, asked, on the next slide, felt that the bishop's pragmatic solution for episcopal pastoral oversight for opponents, this is what had been proposed in the first Manchester Statement, was a pious declaration with no force of law. So they'd kind of worked out a way of doing informal pastoral care, but nothing more than that. This, I think, was a less than veiled threat to the church to ensure that the Act of Synod gained the force of law. And quite extraordinarily, Frank Field commented that parishes that had passed the resolutions must be protected from bishops who had ordained women, lest they should wear them down by presenting a male priest who was actually in favour of the measure. Now, even though at the end of the debate in the Commons there were only 21 votes against the ordination of women, including from such liberals as Ian Paisley, and interestingly, the number of non-Anglicans voting against was quite significant. There were 215 in favour. But it's clear that the debate played a very strong part in helping give the Act of Synod, with its so-called Resolution C and extended episcopal care for opponents, to give that the kind of force of law. It's just a resolution of synod with a bit of extra gusto, that's all it really is, but it gained a kind of force of law. So Patrick Cormac commented that although the Ecclesiastical Committee had not got bogged down in the theological differences, it had instead focused on so-called safeguards. If it had got bogged down in theological differences, they might not have ever done it. It's partly, if not largely, Cormac said, a result of cross-examination in the committee that we had the promise of the Act of Synod, that it was incorporated in the Second Manchester Statement, which came to be known as Bonds of Peace. Who did they listen to? They listened to the opponents and hardly anybody else. Now, throughout the Commons debate, it's clear that many had listened to that rhetoric of marginalisation and victimhood. We hear that over and over again, victimhood from the opponents. Indeed, there was hardly a word spoken in the debate about the safeguards for the women who'd been marginalised for centuries. A noble exception was Tony Benn, himself the son of a pioneer advocate of women's ministry, who made one of the few unequivocal speeches that took a different approach. Responding to the calm presentation that had come from Michael Allison, the Second Church Estates Commissioner who represents the Church in the House of Commons, responding to that, Tony Benn said, "I found it offensive to be told that the House need not worry because there will be safeguards for male priests against ordained women coming into their parishes. Safeguards? My God! What sort of man wants a safeguard in case a woman gives communion in his parish?" And speaking about the financial package, he felt the House was facing an absurdity. If any compensation is to be given, it should be given to the women who have waited so patiently for the right to be ordained. It's wonderful that one can still clap Tony Benn from the grave. Most speeches, however, sympathise solely with the views of the opponents. Again, defending establishment, Patrick Cormac asserted that the Church can only be broadly based and national if it is characterised by tolerance and can say to those of us who have not changed, "You are still welcome." It should also say to priests and those who have the vocation to be priests that the highest offices of the Church are still open to them. And that, it should be remembered, is precisely what resolutions A and B and the bishops' informal pastoral arrangements, what they were all supposed to do. But as so often, the rhetoric of marginalisation and victimhood won the day. So Tim Renton, a supporter of women's ordination, but representing a seat within the boundaries of the Diocese of Chichester, he asked Michael Allison, "What guarantees can be given to such people that the Act of Synod will not be withdrawn later in a different climate of opinion?" And Michael Allison, I think, gave a very telling response. The Church is trying to get to the heart of the necessary unanimity and goodwill spelt out in the Act of Synod. It is doing that in a compressive, if necessarily broad brush way, not with the kind of minute protection against litigious tendencies that is so much a feature of our legislation in the House and to some extent in the Synod. Against that disappointment of the Synod's not coming forward gracefully and offering that safeguard, however, we have to set the behaviour of the House of Bishops. 2 unanimous statements were made, the second strengthening the first, about how rights of that minority can be protected. Even then, the Second Estates Commissioner had bought the idea that the safeguards that were offered in the measure were insufficient. Later on in the debate, in a response to Tony Benn, he commented that pastoral arrangements are about matters of confidence and trust, not law. Flexibility, he said, is needed to adapt to the many different circumstances that will affect individual priests and parishes. Nor can there be any guarantee that the measure, which will in any event take 2 years to enact, could be carried through all its stages in the synod. So I think one can't help but wonder what would have happened if the bishops hadn't panicked and convinced themselves that the original safeguards were in fact insufficient. What would have happened if the threats of the very noisy minority and the members of the ecclesiastical committee and that kind of constant bombardment of lobbying, if that had just simply been ignored? Once again, it was Tony Benn who got to the heart of the matter. The whole debate, he felt, raised the absolute absurdity of the establishment of the Church of England. But many parliamentarians used the right they had to persuade the Church to add the extra safeguards of the Act of Synod and to ensure that it was treated as if it had the force of law. Most of them said that they weren't at all interested in theology, but just wanted to protect the rights of this noisy minority. But had they been able to reflect theologically, we might never have ended up with the incoherence of the church within a church that has emerged from the PEV system, the nonsense of the See of Oswestry and all that. Instead, we might have ended up with something like the sort of solution that every other Anglican church that's ordained women has operated, which has operated kind of informal, temporary, pastorally sensitive arrangements for oversight, but nothing that's been put there with the force of law into structures that you would end up with the nonsense of alternative chrism masses and all that. Finally, I think it's important to note that things have changed completely in relation to the Church and Parliament. So when it came to the women bishops legislation, there was very little parliamentary interest in disaffected opponents at all. Instead, Tony Baldry, the Second Estates, Church Estates Commissioner, issued a scarcely veiled threat. It would be impossible, he said, to steer through the House of Commons any measure which left a scintilla of a suggestion that women bishops were in some way to be second-class bishops, whatever future changes Synod does or does not make to the draft legislation. It's crucial that it confers the same legal authority and responsibilities on women diocesan bishops as on their male counterparts. So far from holding the Church of England back, in 2012 to 2014, Parliament was now encouraging further changes towards equality. But however much things might have changed, and I think, can I have the next list? However much things might have changed, the real damage was done in 1993. A structural solution urged on by an overactive Parliament, chiefly to appease frightened bishops, was created by an Act of Synod, and the 5 guiding principles suggest that that is now here to stay. So, if I had the next slide, in a year that we're celebrating 30 years of women priests, we can also lament the fact that it was the establishment that forced the institutionalized schism, which the 5 guiding principles seem to suggest is with us forever. So perhaps we should remove the monopoly on prayers to St. Wilfrid and St. Hilda to pray for us as well as we try to find a way out of the damage inflicted on the Church in 1993, which is, as we all know, it seems to be setting a precedent for the choose your own bishop scheme that we might be moving into today. This is an extraordinarily long way from the Act of Uniformity, And dare I say it, and here I echo Theo, it's a long way from our Lord's injunction that we might all be one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was really interesting, isn't it, to go over that ground? I'm sure lots of us appreciated that. So have we got any questions? Kristen, thank you. So here's our first question. The vast majority of members of the Church of England are unaware of the history of how we got to the present position. How do we change that? And what are the key messages to share in order to underpin a movement for change?
Is that on? Yes. I mean, how do we change? How do we make people aware of the history history of the movement for the ordination of women, but also the history of the various bits of legislation and how we end up with the mess? At the moment, history in the Church of England is at an extraordinarily low ebb. Like one other person sitting in this room, I was a member of the history bit of the LLF. We did a lot of really interesting work, and I'm writing a book on homosexuality in the Church of England in the 20th century. But none of it found its way into the final document, or virtually nothing found its way into it. There's an ignorance, I think, among many, including in the senior leadership of the Church, of the history, and as if these things were set in stone for all time. So I think in some ways, campaigning organisations need to make as much as they can of that history aware as best they can. So not simply talking from the present, but also re-engaging with the past. The Act of Synod isn't ecclesiastical law. Those bishops, those flying bishops, are simply suffragan bishops of Canterbury and York and London. That's it. They could be withdrawn overnight, but they've now got in this 5 guiding principles. It's as if this thing is now here forever. We will always protect those minorities. At some stage, we need to re-engage, as Theo was saying, with what it means to be one church, united around the gospel of Jesus Christ. What are we doing? What does that say to the wider world when we can't even agree with ourselves? And those are pressing for us at the moment as we're facing different issues over, different but related issues over homosexuality and same-sex marriage in the church. So we need to really engage about how we can be one with difference rather than simply agree that we need to be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 with difference. So that becomes central.
Thank you. I haven't got very much time, but I'm going to put these 2 questions together. What are your views on the influence of Parliament on exemptions for the Church to the 2010 Equality Act? And if Parliament caused the 5 GPs to become what they are, can we lobby Parliament to revoke them?
I mean, I think it does say quite a lot about the nature of establishment. What right do 26 bishops have to sit in the House of Lords if they're representing an institution that can't get equality itself? If they're no longer representing the broad, I mean, they're there presumably because at some point they represented the broad moral consensus of the nation. They definitely no longer do that. If you look at the statistics, they undoubtedly no longer represent the vast majority of the nation on homosexuality, on women's equality. So it does raise a big question about how they can justify their existence into the future. And so I think in lots of ways the Equality Act becomes that. It could be the eventual sort of end of establishment, but it would be much better to retain the establishment by ensuring that the equality is part of the Church of England as well. But it does raise the question of why we continue to have bishops when they no longer represent the broad moral opinion of the country. Oh yeah, one can certainly lobby if one establishment is there, even if it is somewhat anomalous to have people of no faith or whatever to legislate for the Church of England. While it's still there, there's no reason why Parliament shouldn't change that. I could imagine it would create quite a big stir in the church, but it might help the General Synod get its act in order as well.
Okay, one quick one. How can it be justified that priests about to be ordained have to assent to the 5 guiding principles when so many do not agree with them? Which Theo mentioned the Time survey, which showed that 2/3 of clergy want to see them come to an end. What can be done about it? We are encouraging dishonesty by asking people to sign something that they don't agree with.
I mean, I guess insofar as they're descriptive, that's one thing. They are describing the situation of the church. The church is living with that incoherence. I think it needs to go a lot further back, and it's about why is it that we are still selecting people for serving in a church with who don't agree that the Church of England has made that clear decision. But we've ended up with the incoherence that says that's okay. We no longer have an act of uniformity. We no longer have a sense of agreement within the church. If we recognise that, we can recognise we've got institutional schism. The church is not going to do that, but it needs to own up that that's the case. So I think, again, like Theo was saying, we've got to be open and honest that that is in fact the situation we face. It's not an ideal situation. It's a situation that needs to be changed. How one can do that is, again, a completely different task and a different set of objectives. And that's something that organisations like Watch really need to begin to engage with in earnest.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. I have to leave it there.